Restaurants' automatic tips policy hits the rock. Giving tips as showing appreciation to waiters and waitresses after dining in restaurants is part of the American culture. The average tip amount is 10% to 15% of the total meal cost. Some restaurants have included an automatic 18% tips for parties of 8 or more. A recent updated tax rule is causing restaurants to rethink the practice of adding automatic tips to the tabs of large parties. The Internal Revenue Service will begin classifying those automatic gratuities as service charges, which will be treated as regular wages and thus be subject to payroll tax withholdings. Restaurants usually leave it up to the employees to report tips as income. The change would mean more paperwork and added costs for the restaurants, and a potential financial impact for waiters and waitresses who live on their tips but don't always report them fully. Restaurants are required to report to the IRS what their employees report as tips income to pay Medicare and Social Security taxes on those amounts. Restaurants are eligible for an income tax credit for some or all of those payments, but service charges are not eligible, according to Mariana Dyson, a payroll tax attorney in Washington, D.C., who represents restaurant chains. Restaurants' automatic gratuities help ensure that the tips supplement the servers' salaries, which are often less than the federal minimum wage of $7.25 an hour. But many people don't like the idea of treating tips as wages, which will require upfront withholdings of federal taxes, and they won't see that tip money until payday. I don't want my tips to be on my paycheck as a wage. I like to get my tips at the end of my shift, because I know what I'm getting right away, says Tammy Cordoba, a 54-year-old server at a Longhorn Steakhouse. Miss Cordoba, who usually makes an additional several $100s a week in tips on top of her minimum wage, said she never knew exactly how much she would get each week in tips. Getting paid at the end of each shift helps her to budget. The updated rule clarifies that automatic tips are service charges because they are not voluntary. The IRS provided an example of a restaurant suggesting different tip amounts, and they stated that the practice is not subject to federal withholdings because customers are still free to choose whether or how much to tip. I think the vast majority of restaurant owners will discontinue the practice, says Denise Wheeler, an employment attorney who represents several restaurant chains.